It is now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Jason Dougal. Jason Dougal is the president of the National Center on Education and the Economy and the former CEO of the National Institute for School Leadership. Jason has served as a senior consultant to state departments of education, legislatures, and governors' commissions across the country. He also has led numerous benchmarking trips across the world to some of the highest performing education systems. So maybe we could do this in Europe next year? Better yet, maybe he'll start leading some of those trips to Ohio. So please join me in welcoming this morning Jason Dougal.
All right. Am I on? Yep, great. I'm not going to stay at the podium. First, let me thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. Thank you to Ohio Excels. Thank you to the Governor's Office of Workforce Transformation, and thank you to all of you, and not just for being here, but you're going to need to participate over the course of the next hour. As my 4 kids tell me, Dad, no one wants to listen to you talk for an hour. And I understand that. But before we get into that, let me first introduce our organization just to make sure, I'm sure almost no one here is familiar with the National Center on Education and the Economy. We're a relatively small organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. As our name would suggest, we work at the intersection of education and the economy. For over 35 years, we've been conducting a particular brand of research on education systems around the world. And I want to just pause on that for a moment because I think it's really important. For those of you in education, which is many of you in this audience, you know that the education research model that we use comes out of the medical profession, right? When we want to figure out if something works or not, we take a group, we randomly divide it into 2, one a control, the other a treatment. We administer that treatment, whatever it might be, a math intervention, to one group. We don't administer it to the other. And if math scores improve, we attribute that improvement to that math intervention. And then the idea is all of you should now implement with fidelity that program. This approach to research makes a ton of sense if what you're evaluating is a biological system like the human body. Because penicillin, well, unless you have an allergy or some extreme circumstance, penicillin's going to work on you just like it's going to work on me. It's going to work on a kid in New York similarly to a kid in Ohio. But we all know in this room, we are not dealing with a biological system. We are dealing with a social system, a system in which a math intervention that works with students in rural Mississippi may not perform the same here in Columbus, Ohio. And so our whole approach to research, according to our organization, is flawed. Instead, we take our research from what we call international benchmarking, what comes out of industry, industrial benchmarking. David Kearns from the Xerox Corporation made this a way to approach competition in the 1980s when Xerox was struggling to compete with companies from around the world, especially Japanese companies. And so what he did is he looked to the industry leaders and tried to understand holistically what it is they do differently than what it is his company did. And he didn't try to emulate that, he tried to beat it. He tried to learn from them so that Xerox could become what it did become, one of the largest companies in the world at the time. We take that same approach to research, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But let's get to that interactive part. Before we do, just to frame the hour, we're going to take a look to the most recent past, last 25 years or so. We're going to then take a look around. We're going to look at what other systems are doing, what's happening right now, and then we're going to take a look ahead before I finish with the hour that I have. But let's take a quick look behind. The world has changed a lot for our students in the last 25 years. So let's take a gander down 25 years ago. And I'll start here, and I'm going to ask you all to yell out what those icons represent. Yell them out. Google, yeah. Bluetooth, I heard Bluetooth. Wikipedia. MySpace, good. A lot of people don't get that one. They're like, what is that? Right? And of course, Facebook. Right? So if you're a student in post-secondary education right now, you were born likely between 2003 and 2006, you don't know a world in which these companies didn't exist. You don't know a world in which any information you could possibly want wasn't accessible on your computer if you had an internet connection. This is a generation who has no idea what the Encyclopedia Britannica is, unless they looked it up on Wikipedia, right? How about our high school students, students born between 2007 and 2010? How about these icons? What are these? Gmail? I hear YouTube? Twitter? Yeah, X now. And that's just an icon for an iPhone, right? So for these students, they don't know a world in which they couldn't immediately communicate with anyone around the globe. They could get information instantaneously. And because of the iPhone, not only could they get any information they ever wanted from their computer, they now could get it from their pocket. How about our middle schoolers? Students born between 2011 and 2013. How about these icons? Shout them out. As Android? Wi-Fi, yep, we've started to get Wi-Fi. Instagram, Snapchat. What are we missing? Airbnb. And then the icon for an iPad. For these students, not only could they instantaneously communicate with anyone around the globe and have any information they could possibly want in their pocket, but they could see real-time video and pictures. They don't just have to read about it, they can see it in real time. They're connected to students all over the world. How about our elementary students? How about these four? These are students born between 2014 and 2019. How about these four icons? What do we got? You got TikTok, yeah, anybody who's got kids knew that one quickly, right? 5G, the Apple Watch. How about that other one? Alexa. Yeah. So these are students who will never know a world in which they can give a voice command to a machine and it will respond. It will answer a question. It will play music, right? I'll date myself. That's some real Jetsons stuff, right? Right? How about this last one? These are for students who are just entering our school now. What's that icon? ChatGPT, OpenAI. For students entering our schools now, they will never know a world in which artificial intelligence doesn't exist. Their relationship with technology will be different than anything we've ever experienced before. For them, technology won't just be a tool that makes their life easier or makes their work more productive. For them, technology will feel more like a colleague. They will work side by side with technology. Technology could be something that replaces them depending on the skill level they have, or enhances them depending on the skill level they have. So my question for you, because the participation isn't just you get to yell out the names of icons. all right? But I'm going to ask you, just with an elbow partner right at your table, to answer a question for me. Are the schools you're associated with, maybe it's the school you work in, maybe it's the school you work connected to, maybe it's the school your children go to, or maybe it's the school you go to, but a school you're very familiar with, is that school adequately preparing all students for a world in which artificial intelligence is going to be like a colleague to that student when they enter the workforce? Take a second, seeing some heads shake, but I want to take a second. I'm going to give you 1 full minute. Talk to the person next to you. All right, if I could, I'm going to ask you to stop your conversation and bring your attention back up here. I know this is the hardest part. And I usually do this with rooms full of 40 people, not 400 people. And I'm going to ask you, rather than what I would typically do, which is ask you all to give me some feedback, I'm going to ask you to give me the feedback by show of hands. How many folks out there in their conversation decided, yeah, we're doing a pretty darn good job. We are preparing all students adequately for the world in which they're going to go into? If you could, just raise your hand if that was the conversation you had. Okay. All right. How about, did anybody have a conversation in which you said, well, maybe we're not quite there yet, but with some tweaks, we could be there. We're kind of close. We're just not quite there with all students, or we just made some tweaks. We'd be there. How about a show of hands? Is that where the conversation was? See, one hand and a couple. How about a couple of other hands? Okay. How about how many people were in a conversation in which you said, "Gosh, we are not even close yet"? It would. I guess I don't have to go much further. Where we really have to rethink assessment. We have to rethink what we're teaching, how we teach it, who teaches it, and how they're supported, right? How we align with the outside world. Just again, could I get a show of hands? I just want to kind of see that again. Yeah, it seems like the vast majority. The group over here, they didn't have any conversation. They didn't vote at all. So that's okay. That's okay. We'll get you later. So I want you to keep that in mind, because it will come back in a few slides to be really important. So just hold that in your mind for a moment, and let's move to the next slide. Because there are a lot of folks out there, some futurists and talking heads who talk about technology and say, well, we won't have jobs for everybody in the future. We might need universal basic income because so many people will be out of jobs. Technology has evolved for centuries. And it has changed the face of work, but it hasn't changed whether there are jobs out there for folks. And so if you look at the research from the World Economic Forum, they basically agree that it's not that jobs are going to go away in total. It's that some jobs are going to go away and other jobs are going to be created. And so if you look here in the sort of pinkish color, those are the numbers of jobs that the World Economic Forum anticipates will disappear due to technology over the next 5 years. And then if you look at the boxes that are, and each box represents 1 million jobs. If you look at the yellow or gold boxes, those are the jobs that the World Economic Forum expects to be created due to technology. And what you see is mostly the total won't change. That's the good news. The bad news is, for those who aren't being adequately prepared, that the skill set needed to get jobs that are in that pinkish hue are very different than the skill set you need to get the new jobs in the gold color. Let's take a look at what some of those jobs are that are disappearing and what some of those jobs are that are growing. I'm not going to read them all, but I'll read a few from the fastest declining jobs. Bank clerks, postal service clerks, cashier and ticket clerks, data entry clerks, administrative and executive secretaries. Okay? Just real quick, what did you notice about the jobs I just mentioned? Say out loud. Yeah, face-to-face. Okay? How about the fastest growing jobs? AI and machine learning specialists, sustainability specialists, business intelligence analysts, fintech engineers, data analysts and engineers. What do you notice about those jobs? Anybody? Yell it out. STEM. What word do you see in all those declining jobs over and over again? Clerk. What words do you see in the fastest growing jobs over and over again? Analyst, engineer, specialist, right? We need a whole different set of skills. And here they are. Again, from the World Economic Forum research from last year. When you rank in order of performance from employers what they're looking for, they're looking for analytical thinking, creative thinking, resilience, flexibility, and agility. They're looking for curiosity and lifelong learning skills, right? They're looking for empathy and active listening. They're looking for a very different set of skills to be prepared for the new world that students are entering than most of our schools are supporting for those students. And here's the real kicker, and if you leave here forgetting pretty much everything I say because you were on your phone answering emails while I was talking, I'm sorry, no one would do that. I get it, right? I've always said, I've got to be much better at what I do now than I had to be a long time ago, because you don't have to leave, you can just check out. You're looking right there, and it looks like you're here, but you're not. But pay attention to this slide. To me, this slide is the most important slide that I'm going to show you today. What does it represent? It's household income by quintile, by 20%, of the bottom 5 lines, and the top line is top 5% of income, just for illustrative purposes. All right, and what this shows is income distribution in the United States since about 1970 to about 2020, the last data we have. So it covers a 50-year period. So over on the far left, that income distribution represents the most equitable distribution of income in the world, in the industrialized world. Said in another way, the United States enjoyed shared prosperity like no other country on earth. Now let's go to 2021, the end of the graph on your side, the far right. What that income distribution represents is the least equitable income distribution in the industrialized world. In 50 years, we went from the most equitable distribution of income to the least equitable distribution of income in the industrialized world. It is not that our economy is suffering all around. It is who is participating and who is benefiting from that economy. And I link this graph to this one. Because if we are producing students who are ready for the jobs in pink in large numbers, and we are not producing students who are ready for the gold jobs in large numbers, we are driving demand for those jobs and therefore wages and income up for those students who graduate with the skills that are needed. These skills. And we're leaving a vast majority of our students to fight for a decreasing number of low-skilled jobs, which pushes their income down. In addition, we are seeing jobs that require higher skills being offshored constantly. But for every one that's offshored, 10 jobs are being lost to technology right now. In that world, we will continue to have this income disparity if we don't change our education system. If we don't have an education system that answers to the challenge I posed initially, preparing students for a world of AI, that's preparing students with these types of skills. Because quite frankly, to me, why this slide is so important is that this isn't just about economics. It's not just about jobs. I ask you somewhat rhetorically, how long can a democracy thrive when this is true? With that, I want to change gears for a moment and come back to the research that my organization does. Remember, I said we don't conduct the type of research that 95% of the research in education is done. We do something very, very different. We look to find high-performing districts, states, and countries, and we study them holistically. We don't just study what they do in math. We study how they approach curriculum development. We study how they approach assessment. We study how they approach teacher preparation. We study how teachers work together on a daily basis and how leaders are nurtured. We study how the system of education is linked to whatever the next step is in their education system or in their workforce development system or in their economy. So, why do we look globally? And this appears to be quite small on the screen, so I apologize for that. But we look globally because we no longer here in Ohio compete with Kentucky and Indiana and maybe Cleveland if we're here in Columbus, or right now, competition is global. You are competing with all of those folks in neighboring states and in Tennessee and in Florida and California, but you're also competing with Finland, and you're competing with Estonia and Canada and Singapore and China, right? And so from our perspective at NCEE, we're trying to study all of the competitors. We're trying to understand what makes those competitors that are out competing us do so, and to learn from them, just like David Kearns did at Xerox, how to beat them. I won't go into deep detail on this slide, but just know that we use for our measure of excellence the PISA exam, which is administered by the OECD, the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is headquartered in Paris. And about 78, I believe, or 79 countries now take the PISA exam. And it's administered to 15-year-olds all across the world. They test in reading, math, literacy, and now creative thinking. Although the U.S. did not participate in creative thinking in the 2022 administration. Because this exam is being given all around the world, it can't test a curriculum. And I actually think that's a wonderful thing. It doesn't test students' ability to regurgitate a curriculum they learned. It asks students to transfer and apply knowledge they have in a discipline to a novel problem. Like a made-up organism in science that you'd have to analyze to understand how it operates, right? You have to use your scientific knowledge to do that. So, oh, well, that went fast. Thank you, whoever did that, because it clearly wasn't me. So I'm going to just show you the mathematics results because they're most stark, and I don't have time to spend showing you everything. What this shows, by virtue of the students walking along this number line, is how students in various jurisdictions performed in relation to the United States in mathematics at age 15. What is shown here is not all of the countries that outperformed the United States 15-year-olds on PISA, because there would be 38 of them. But instead, it shows mostly, I think I'm one slide off here. Okay, I don't know if I did that, but what this shows is all jurisdictions that average performance is more than a year beyond the United States performance. So you have countries that you might have guessed you would see, like Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, Hong Kong, and Korea. But you also have countries like Estonia, Switzerland, Canada, Netherlands, and Ireland. The Singapore one is in particularly terrifying, because at age 15, their students on average are 5.5 years beyond ours in mathematics. In 15 years, they got 5.5 years ahead. And I know what some of you are likely thinking. They don't test all kids. And I can tell you that for the OECD to allow you in PISA, you have to. Now, they don't test every kid they sample, but all kids need to be a part. I think it's got to be at least 96 or something % of the 15-year-old population that has to be eligible to be sampled in this. So the idea that this is some creamed group compared to our regular kids, I can dispel that notion right now. But even more importantly, I can imagine many of you are saying, hey, there are no Bill Gateses coming out of Singapore, right? Our elite students outperform all elite students. They drive our economy. Okay, that one worked. Here's the top 10% of math students in the US compared to the top 10% of math students around the world. If you look at that graph, it doesn't change all that much. Our problem is not that our average or below average students are being outperformed. All of our students, our top students, are being outperformed. Now you might say, well, I don't really know what that tests, so really I don't care all that much, right? Because I can't really make heads or tails of that. So, this is fun. Okay, so let's talk about what it means. 80% or so of students in the US can recognize main idea, cause and effect, and if conclusions are warranted. Okay, that's good. And about 2/3 can compare the distance across two different routes on a road or convert currency, which is to say they can do basic operations. But let's look below the line, where they struggle. 14% of US 15-year-olds on PISA can distinguish between fact and opinion. And 11% can apply scientific knowledge to an unfamiliar situation. Remember what I described earlier of taking your scientific knowledge and applying it to an organism you've never seen. And 7% can use math in complex situations to model. I'm going to give you 1 minute at your tables again, just to talk to an elbow partner. And this time, what I want you to talk about, because this is national and international data. So these statistics, does what I have said so far, does it resonate with you? Or will you say, hey, that might be true nationally, but it's not true in my district, it's not true in my school, it's not true in my community. And that's reasonable, but I'm curious from you, Take a minute, talk to your elbow partner. When you see everything that I've described so far, does it resonate and you say, yeah, that feels like you're telling the story of my community? Or does it feel like, no, that's really not us? Take a minute, talk to your partner. All right, I'm going to ask you to come out of your conversation, and I'm going to use an old school teaching technique. Clap once if you can hear my voice. Clap twice if you can hear my voice. All right, we are back. So, I'm curious. Again, I'm not going to ask on anybody specifically, or at least maybe not, but by show of hands, I'll start in a different place, but how many of you said, yeah, this feels like my community? What you're saying, Jason, resonates. Give me your hands up high. Yeah, that's pretty. Hey, you guys voted this time. All right, look at that. I knew you'd get another chance. All right, so how about others? There were some folks who said, that really doesn't describe my community. That is not true. Anybody in that camp? All right. Where are y'all from? Cincinnati. All right. I'm impressed. That's wonderful, right? Because far too many of our students and far too many of our communities answer to this description. And that's really problematic because they're competing with all of these students, right? It's no longer sufficient just to peer over the fence or look down the street and see what the other school in your community might be doing. Or just look across the border, right, and see what's happening in Indiana or Kentucky so you can figure out what your competition is doing. We've got to be looking globally because we are competing globally. So what is it that we see? 100% you can. That's all right. Sure.
Teachers are having to spend so much time to the study of the test instead of having time to create all of these things. So then when we bring in work-based learning, they go, when am I supposed to have time for this? When I work with Plenary Management Resources, we developed a work-based learning, and we were saying, okay, now we want you to talk to the student. They go, when am I supposed to have time for this? So you think, okay, how much can a teacher do? Our daughter wanted to be a teacher, passionate about it, and had all these creative ideas. She left because she said, I have to just teach to this, Mom. I can't be creative anymore.
Yeah.
So how many teachers are we losing for the very fact? So my question is, when you compare us to these other countries, are you comparing apples to apples? Do they do no kid left behind, which should be mixed out? I mean, is that there?
It is a wonderful question. And stay tuned for the next 10 minutes. You're going to love it. All right? You're going to be really excited. So thank you. Thank you for that question. Because no, those countries don't have a No Child Left Behind. And they don't test nearly as frequently as we do. And they don't have curriculum that is driven towards a regurgitation exam of facts. All right? They don't. What you're going to see is schools that operate like professional work environments that look more like our hospitals and our law firms than they do like our schools. All right? You're going to see that in a moment. And it starts with imagine schools where, right? And imagine schools that were driven more by proficiency that allows students to progress, right? That has world-class teaching and learning to develop confident and engaged self-directed learners, and the whole system is aligned and with coherent leadership. Now, what do I mean by all of that? Because that all sounds nice and flowery, but let's get down to some detail about what looks different in the schools we study that result in students knowing 5.5 more years of mathematics than ours on average. What does that look like? What are we talking about? Well, let's start with something I know people don't like here in the US for good reason, around standards. It's not that these other countries don't have standards, but what they don't have is standards written by some professor somewhere that did a really nice job. I mean, it's a really eloquent description. The problem is, if I handed it out to this room, I'd probably get 400 different answers as to what meets that standard, what's slightly below that standard, and what's slightly above it. But what if our standards were captured in student work, where student work is an exemplar of what meets the standard? And there's also student work that shows what is just shy of that standard and what exceeds that standard. If I want you to learn how to throw a football really well, it's going to be hard for me to sit here and describe it to you, about where you put your thumb and how you hold the laces and where you step with your foot and how you pull your arm back, right? Yeah, some people might be able to go, all right, so I'm going to put my thumb there, all right? Or you could watch somebody throw a football and have somebody describe it to you. You have a much better chance of throwing a football well. The same is true with academic performance. If I could see what a paper looks like that meets the standard, I could understand if my work meets that standard. Notice I said my work, because what this allows is for students to exercise agency. Right now, students hand in work and they have no idea whether it's good, bad, or indifferent until somebody tells them. Right? Somebody gives them a score that usually probably doesn't tell them a whole lot about why. But think about a jurisdiction in which standards are held by examples of student work, where I can sit and compare them. You know who else can? My parents. You know who else can? Teachers. The community. Everyone can see what the standard is and what your performance is. And now we can start to engage in some more metacognitive processes of how do I take my work that isn't yet here and adapt it, amend it, fix it to meet the standard. And when I do, what can I do to exceed the standard? This is a simple thing, but it makes a huge difference. The second thing here, assessment for learning, as opposed to assessment of learning. What most of us in this room would refer to as formative assessment rather than summative assessment. There is no jurisdiction, no high-performing jurisdiction in the world that tests as much as the United States of America. The census testing on an annual basis is incredibly expensive. It is not that we spend more on assessments or that they spend less. What those countries do is they spend their money on fewer assessments and they make them more rigorous. Rigorous, not more difficult, more rigorous. What do I mean by that? You have to write. You have to show what you know. That's expensive to grade, although coming down in expense because of technology. But traditionally, very expensive. That's why AP exams are so expensive. It's not the generation of the questions that's expensive, it's reading the answers, right? And you need humans to do so. And so these high-performing jurisdictions said, no, we're not going to test every kid every year in the core subjects. Instead, we're going to test only at certain points. The end of upper elementary or primary school, roughly 5th grade. The end of what we think of as middle school, 8th grade. And typically some sort of leaving exam at the end of the equivalent of our 10th grade. Because most of these jurisdictions don't have compulsory education that goes beyond the equivalent of our 10th grade. They start to specialize in what would be the equivalent of our 11th and 12th grade. We'll get to that in a moment. So it's not that they spend more money or less money on assessment. They just think of assessment totally differently than we do. And it drives a whole different approach to curriculum and instruction. No longer is curriculum and instruction focused on names and dates and places and being able to do operations in mathematics or name the parts of a flower, right? But instead is aimed at, if I give you a set of facts, can you marshal them to make a compelling argument? If I give you a problem of how much water you would need to fill a swimming pool, and here are the dimensions, how would you think about how to solve that problem? That's a really different type of an exam than what we're often giving. And that speaks to the well-designed curriculum. And the last part, early learning and supports, in a system in which you progress due to proficiency, you sure as heck better be offering early supports. Because if a student falls too far behind, there's not going to be enough runway for them to get that plane off the ground. And so very common in these jurisdictions, 40, 50, 60, 70% of students were given extra support in early grades. It does two things. One, it keeps students on track. Two, it removes the stigma of support, which is frequently, too often, a problem in our schools. What do we mean by world-class teaching and learning? Well, most of these jurisdictions have far fewer teacher prep institutions than we do in our standard state. And here's a good place to suggest, when we look at other jurisdictions, when we look at other countries, the thought can easily be, we should compare that country to our country. In fact, what we at NCE do typically is we compare countries to our individual states. For a couple of reasons. One, they're roughly the same size. I mean, with some exceptions like China, right? But when you look at Singapore, or you look at Finland, or you look at Estonia, or you look at provinces in Canada, the grain size is closer to a U.S. state than it is to the country. There's also all the constitutional authority at the state level for education that you would need to make the changes that would be necessary to compete with and outcompete these countries. And so when we look at how many teacher prep institutions there are in Finland, 7, or in Singapore, 1, it's dwarfed by the number of teacher prep institutions in most of our states. Does anybody know what the number is in Ohio? Sorry? Somewhere over 60. Yeah. Oh, why do I bring that up? Well, in our research across the United States, we are aware of no school of education that has a higher admission standard than the college or university in which it sits. That's not true of the engineering program. It's not true of pre-med. It's not true of pre-law. We are allowing in this country for lots of institutions to let teachers go through a teacher prep program, and we don't have high standards for them vis-a-vis their own university. Okay? I'm not saying we don't have high standards. I'm saying no higher standard than the university in which you're attending. The message being sent, if you can't make it into our School of Engineering or our pre-med program or our pre-law program, there's always the teaching profession for you. That's not a great message for a job that requires as much professional acumen, deep knowledge as any of those other professions I just described: law, medicine, architecture, engineering. But we are signaling that anybody in this university could become a teacher. Not everybody can become an engineer, a lawyer, or a doctor. That is not happening in these jurisdictions. And interestingly enough, you'd think, well, if we limited the number of institutions that prepare teachers, we already have a teacher shortage, Jason. You're going to make it worse. Well, interestingly enough, these jurisdictions that we're talking about, Estonia, Finland, Hong Kong, Singapore, they have upwards of 10 and 20 applicants for every one position in their schools of education because they're high-status institutions. They're in their Tier 1 research institutions. Admission to them is difficult. And in many jurisdictions, if you're going to be a teacher, your tuition's fully paid as long as, well, and it's required that you get assigned to the schools that that jurisdiction wants you to be in. But it increases the likelihood that a real talented but not affluent student would go into teaching. Creates more diversity in the teaching force. So that's the way they think of preparation. How about once you're in the job? I can tell you that there is no jurisdiction in the world that is high performing whose teachers teach nearly as much as our teachers teach. Let me say that again in a different way. Our teachers teach more hours per week than any other high-performing jurisdiction in the world. How is it, getting to your question from a moment ago, that a teacher could possibly do all that they're being asked to do in setting high standards, in teaching a rigorous curriculum, in being a social worker and a counselor to a student, when you teach 6 out of 7 periods a day, when you don't even have the flexibility to choose when you go to the bathroom? And there's only 40 minutes of class, with maybe 5 minutes between classes, right? Imagine a jurisdiction in which teachers teach about half of their workday. The other half spent with other teachers. With other teachers studying, teaching, doing lesson study, engaging in action research, being in each other's classrooms, observing each other, giving feedback, not in an evaluative capacity. But if we here were a teaching group, we would figure out something that we want to study in our own practice, right? We're going to engage in action research, the disciplined study of our own professional practice. And Tori might be teaching a lesson, and Mario and I are in that room watching. We're not evaluating Tori. We're evaluating the lesson, how we can improve it. And we'll debrief afterwards. And Mario, you might be teaching that same lesson tomorrow, and we'll come and do the same thing. But time needs to be built into the day for that type of professional learning. It's analogous to what you see lawyers and doctors do. That's the crazy thing when I go over to these countries, and I've spent a lot of time there. It's not like a mystery where this comes from. And by the way, it's not a mystery to them either. When you ask them, where'd you come up with this model? The answers always come from the United States. You can imagine my frustration, right? And which allow me to segue quickly to leadership development, this idea that teachers have opportunities to take on increasing roles in a world in which they have half of their time not teaching. They can take on roles in which they support their peers, in which they tutor students one-on-one or in small groups, in which they can have the time to reach out to parents and the community and get their support. And I ask, where does this leadership development come from? Does anybody want to take a guess what they say? It comes from the U.S. The United States military. There is still no better organization in this world for executive development, for leadership development than the United States military. And at any position in the United States military, your job is to make yourself obsolete. Because if you're not obsolete, if you are the only person who can do that job, then you cannot be promoted. Because then nobody can do your job. So your job is to make sure somebody else can do what you do so that you can move to the next step. Imagine if schools were that way. Imagine if we built schools in which a good teacher who has shown their ability to support their peers is given the time to support new teachers when they come in. I would suggest the turnover rate would drop dramatically. And in fact, that's what you see in these jurisdictions. You don't see the turnover. You don't see the turnover in teachers or leaders because they work in a professional work environment. They aren't paid a whole lot more. Relative to salaries in their jurisdiction, they're paid relatively more. But they work in a completely different environment. And there's a whole coherent and aligned leadership structure around them, where the leader's job is talent management. Do we have any principals, superintendents, or former principals and superintendents in the room? How many of you would have loved it if your job didn't include the bus schedule, food, right? HR stuff? In these jurisdictions, leaders are leaders of professional work. Their job is to support the capacity building of their teachers. Administration is actually a different job. There's a whole different job and career ladder to lead administration, because the principal's job is to lead the learning of the adults in their school. And the equivalent of a superintendent, because many of these jurisdictions don't have districts as we know them, but they do have clusters of schools. They're analogous. Their job is to lead the learning of all the adults in those schools and give them opportunities to take leadership roles. This is a wholly different model than what we're used to. And it's getting wholly different results than what we're getting. In the last few minutes, I just want to briefly, without stepping on the toes of my colleagues who are going to come up and describe in more detail some of the work that they're doing in states right now, but I want to just quickly describe what happens after 10th grade in some of these jurisdictions around specialization and workforce development. And I'm going to use two sort of big examples. There's sort of two approaches. There's what I would call the Swiss example, and the German work is similar, but I know a lot more about the Swiss model than I do the German, but Mario's here and will be able to describe that in a moment. And without stepping on Erica's toes, the Swiss model is really built on participation by industry and apprenticeships. In a moment, I'm going to show you a slide on Singapore, and you'll see that conceptually they're very similar, but in the way they're applied, they're very different. So what do I mean by that? In the Swiss system, approximately 70% of students enroll in apprenticeships in grade 10. What do I mean by that? They're actually leaving their school and they're working inside companies. And these are not just blue-collar jobs. These are jobs of all ilk and make. You know, you can be interning at CSFB if you are in Switzerland. Employers set the standard. And they're committed to training in these apprenticeships, without a guarantee, by the way, that the apprentice will accept a job in their particular company at the end. Now, many do, of course, as you'd expect. But the idea is that if everybody, all the companies commit to this type of development, you don't have to get your intern or your apprentice. You just need to get somebody's, right? Because they've built those types of skills. And so it combines school-based learning and work-based work. And it's hosted, as I said, by the employer. And many of these students are paid for that work. This is not show and tell. This is not watch me work. This is you are an entry-level employee here at this organization, and you will be treated as such. You will have a regular work schedule just like I do. All right? These programs last 3 to 4 years. If you're a company, you need to be getting something in return for your investment. You can't invest all this time and effort and personnel if that intern, that apprentice, isn't going to be working there for a few years. So we create the incentives for the industry to invest. And just like you'll see in Singapore, graduates, people who have been through these apprenticeships, still have the opportunity that they can go back to university and further their education in a more traditional academic setting. So how about Singapore? Singapore doesn't do it that way. They don't have a hundreds and hundreds of year tradition that comes out of the guild system that builds, public trust in apprenticeships. Singapore's like 60 years old, and they're doing what they're doing inside of what they call Institutes of Technical Education, ITEs. There are 3 of them around the country. But there are conceptually real similarities between what the Swiss are doing and what the Singaporeans are doing. They're closely connected to industry. While students aren't going out into apprenticeships in industry, industry is setting the standard. They are setting the standard for credentials, and those standards are set really high. When I was lucky enough to go and spend some time in the ITEs in Singapore, what I saw in the work that I saw there was on a level of what you would see here in Tier 1 universities in the United States. In fact, when I asked them, because I got a moment to just tell this quick story, I was watching, I didn't know this until I visited, most of post-production movie production is now done in Singapore. The lighting and the effects and such. And I'm watching students build this set where the idea is they're supposed to show light coming off a pool at nighttime, so sort of a dark blue under light of 2 characters. And I asked the professor, where does this come from? How did you figure out what it is you need to do to build the skills of the students? And he mentioned something I didn't know anything about until I did some more research. He mentioned Full Sail University. Full Sail University is in Florida. And if anybody knows it, and there's some people who are shaking their head, if you know, over the last decade, more than 75% of Oscars for technical categories have gone to Full Sail University graduates. They are the pinnacle. They are the standard when it comes to that type of technical work. And Singapore went there to benchmark what it is they were going to do, because that's how they think about skills, and that's how they think about credentials of value. And about 25% of Singapore students enroll in ITEs, and another about 1/3 go to polytechnics. So it's a significant percentage of the student population that are doing more applied learning. But just like in Switzerland, grads can still go on to polytechnic, which is usually more advanced manufacturing type of training, or to the traditional academic university. Those pathways don't close down for them. They still exist. And so I'm going to end with 2 quick things. I'm not going to read and present this because I'm right at the end of my time, but this is a slide of some things that leaders in these countries that I had been describing are thinking about, because they are doing what NCEE does. They are benchmarking each other. If I want to know what Finland's doing, I can ask in Singapore. Want to know why? Because they're studying it. They see it as a competitive game, and they want to know. Estonia knows what Canada's doing. Hong Kong knows what Singapore's doing. They are constantly competing. But I'll leave you with this quote. And it's attributed to Deming. I don't know if that's actually accurate, but I love the quote itself. And the quote is this: "Your system is perfectly aligned to get the results you are getting." Your system is perfectly aligned to get the results you are getting. if you don't like the results you are getting, the answer is not to pile more on, to ask more of hardworking, genuinely dedicated, smart people. The answer is to rethink the incentives, the supports, and the structures in which those people work. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you.